Picture the Nile Valley in 2560 BC. Not the Egypt of museums and documentaries. The actual place. The smell of wet mud and fish in 30-degree heat before sunrise. Workers eating bread with grit in it because the millstones ground flint into the flour. A civilization that lasted 3,000 years and that almost nobody in it could read. That's what this is about. The sensory, physical, daily reality of ancient Egypt. What the pyramids looked like when they were new. What a pharaoh actually controlled. And what ordinary Egyptians were doing while none of us were watching. Start with the pyramids, because almost everything you picture about them is wrong. The Great Pyramid of Giza was finished around 2560 BC. For the next 3,800 years it was the tallest structure on Earth. Nothing human-built surpassed it until Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311 AD. When it was built, it was not the sandy brown you see in photographs. The outer casing was polished white limestone, quarried from Tura, across the river. It reflected sunlight so intensely that ancient writers called it a blinding star. The casing stones are almost entirely gone now, stripped for later building projects in Cairo. What remains is the core, the scaffolding, the skeleton. The original surface disappeared. Now, the workers. For 2 centuries the standard story was slaves built the pyramids. That version comes largely from Herodotus, a Greek historian who visited Egypt in 450 BC, 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. In 1990, archaeologists found the actual workers' village at Giza. Bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, cemeteries with healed broken bones showing surgical care. These were paid laborers. Rotating gangs of around 10,000 men, working in shifts. They got meat, fish, and beer as wages. Ration records survive on limestone fragments. Some graffiti scratched into blocks by the gangs themselves survived 35 centuries. One crew called themselves Friends of Khufu. Another, Drunkards of Menkaure. The logistics behind the pyramids are the part that makes modern engineers quiet. The Great Pyramid contains around 2.3 million stone blocks. Average weight, 2.5 tons. The heaviest blocks in the King's Chamber weigh up to 80 tons. They were placed with tolerances of less than half a millimeter. In 2017, a survey team using cosmic ray muon imaging found a previously unknown void inside the pyramid. Large as a passenger jet, still unexplained. Nobody has been inside. The pyramid was already 4,000 years old by the time of Julius Caesar. To Caesar, Khufu was as ancient as Caesar is to us. Now the Nile, because without it Egypt does not exist. Not as a metaphor, literally. The habitable strip of Egypt was never wider than about 20 kilometers on either bank. Beyond that, desert. The Egyptians had a word for it, Deshret, the red land. The fertile strip they called Kemet, the black land, after the dark flood silt. Every year the Nile flooded between June and September, predictably, on schedule. When the flood was too low, famine. When it was too high, it wiped out villages. Records from the Old Kingdom show at least 7 major famines in 500 years. The Nile's flood carried such rich sediment that Egyptian soil yielded 3 crops a year without fertilizer. Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Egypt was the easiest land in the world to farm. He wasn't wrong, but he missed the catch. Every scrap of that productivity depended on one river staying in its pattern. Now the pharaoh. Because what a pharaoh actually was in practice is different from the golden statues. Specifically, the living embodiment of Horus, son of Osiris, and after death, Osiris himself. This wasn't theology for temples. It was the operating system of the state. The pharaoh's divine status meant that every order he gave carried religious weight. Disobeying the pharaoh was cosmologically dangerous, not just politically inconvenient. In practice, the pharaoh ran an empire through around 40 administrative districts called nomes. Each had a governor, a nomarch, who collected taxes and answered to the capital. Tax was paid in grain, linen, cattle, and labor. No coinage in Egypt until the 4th century BC. The economy ran on grain the way ours runs on money. Grain was stored in state granaries, redistributed as wages, used to fund armies. The administration was enormous. Scribes were the backbone of Egyptian bureaucracy. To become a scribe took years of training starting around age 5. Less than 1% of the population was literate. Scribes knew this, and their own texts make clear they considered themselves a class apart. One papyrus from around 1200 BC lists every profession and explains why being a scribe is better than all of them. The carpenter gets splinters. The sandal maker smells of leather. The farmer breaks his back. The scribe, says the text, sits in a chair and gives orders. Now the ordinary person. Because 90% of ancient Egypt was farmers. They worked the land they didn't own, paid a portion of everything they grew as tax. They ate bread, beer, onions, garlic, lentils, and fish when they could get it. Egyptian bread was made from emmer wheat, baked in clay molds over open fires. Analysis of Egyptian mummies shows severe dental wear across all social classes. The grit from millstones and wind-blown sand ground teeth down to the gum line by middle age. Beer was safer than water in a society without sewage separation. It was thick, grain-heavy, low in alcohol. More like liquid bread than what you'd recognize. Workers on the pyramids received a daily ration of 4 to 5 liters of it. The workday started before sunrise to avoid the worst of the afternoon heat. By noon, construction stopped. The desert sun at midday in Giza reaches 45 degrees Celsius. Tools were copper, not iron. Iron didn't appear in Egyptian construction until around 600 BC. Copper dulls fast on limestone. Toolmakers worked constantly to resharpen everything. The precision cut of granite in places like the King's Chamber is still debated. Copper tools can't cut granite efficiently. Likely they used a sand abrasion method, grinding with quartz sand and water. It would have been slow, brutally slow. Years per chamber. The medicine is one of the stranger parts. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated to around 1600 BC, is the oldest known surgical text on Earth. It describes 48 cases of injuries, head wounds, broken bones, dislocations, each with diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. Case 6 is a skull fracture with exposed brain matter. The recommended treatment is rest, raw meat applied to the wound, and monitoring. Raw meat was used specifically because it carries vasoconstrictors that reduce swelling. That's not superstition. That's empirical medicine that happens to be correct. Egyptian doctors distinguished between conditions that could be treated, those where treatment was uncertain, and those they couldn't help. That's a triage system. In 1600 BC, the religion organized everything else. Around 2,000 distinct gods at various points in Egyptian history. But most Egyptians interacted with a handful of local deities and household gods. Bes, a dwarf god who protected pregnant women and newborns, was in almost every home. Pregnancy amulets featuring Bes have been found from Egypt to Spain, carried by traders. The afterlife required a body, hence mummification. But the process most people picture was expensive. A full 70-day process with canopic jars and linen wrapping was for the wealthy. Ordinary people were wrapped in simple linen and buried in the desert sand. The dry sand often mummified them naturally. Some of the oldest preserved Egyptian bodies came from simple sand burials. The sand doesn't care about status. By the time the New Kingdom began around 1550 BC, Egypt had been a functioning civilization for over 1,000 years. It had already outlasted every civilization that existed when it started. The Rome that conquered Egypt in 30 BC had existed for about 700 years. Egypt was 4 times older than the empire that ended it. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, lived closer to the moon landing than to the building of the Great Pyramid. The civilization that built those pyramids was already ancient history when she was alive. What ancient Egypt actually was a society that lasted long enough to forget its own origins. It survived droughts, invasions, civil wars, 3 intermediate periods of collapse and reconstruction. And through all of it, the Nile flooded every June. The scribes kept writing. The bread had grit in it. The pyramids were already 2,000 years old when the last hieroglyph was carved in 394 AD. After that, nobody alive could read them. The language went silent for 1,500 years. Until 1822, when Champollion cracked the Rosetta Stone and an entire civilization started speaking again. What came back wasn't myth. It was administrative records, love poems, medical cases, workers' graffiti, grocery lists, people complaining about their bosses, letters to dead relatives asking for help, a father writing to his dead wife asking her to stop sending him bad dreams. 3,000 years and the concerns don't change much, just the language.